Okay, so this is going to be part one of the exam review. The first thing is that I picked a few questions from each section. The majority of the questions are coming from after exam one. So exam 2 and 3 in the last part we covered, those are going to be the majority of the questions to make sure that it's a balanced exam. And we had a lot of theory in the beginning, but not a really testable questions. But I also am going to go back and ask you about specific readings, and I'm going to ask you about theories. Now, one of the things about this exam is to really sort of get a test of what knowledge was covered. Not everyone in the class is going to be asked the same 60 questions. So while there are 60 questions on the exam, they're a quarter a point, which ends up being 15% of your grade. They're not the same questions. And so why that can be problematic, one of the things that I want to talk about, if my computer will cooperate, is that we are going to have a few questions that ask specific readings. We're going to have some questions that ask about things that were covered, but everything that is in the exam is on my slides, right? I don't test you on a question I did not specifically cover myself, right? I feel like that's the only fair way to approach this, right? So the first thing we're going to look at is the very beginning of the course, and we're going to move kind of quickly because there are only a few questions. And so let me go back to where was I hate how this works. It's not I can't always see what I'm sharing versus what you guys see, and I don't want you guys to see the actual exam because then you'll just be writing down the exam questions. I want you to actually know the material, not just know the exam, right? There's difference in behavior. So we're going to go all the way back, and I do want you to know the difference between an objective reality, an intersubjective reality, and a subjective reality. And one second. I just want to make sure the recording was actually picking up the slides. So the first part that I want you to understand is that, and then if those of you that are here have any questions, just feel free to ask. But I am going to go kind of quickly because if I don't cover something, that doesn't mean it's not in the test. That just means that it's like maybe one question out of like the 90 or 100 questions that are possible. So I really want to make sure we cover the material that I know you're going to be asking questions about. When we look at this, right, if I ask you a question about a specific reading, you can open the reading or you can open the PowerPoint that's the reading, right? And so both of those are possibilities. Also, there is no time limit on the final exam, so, right, you can take your time and make sure you get the right answers. You can be like, I'm pretty sure I know this, right? These are options that you can take. There is not a due date set, but if you do not finish the exam by next Friday, that's when I'm going to start looking at grade submission, right? So you're really at this point, for those of you watching right now, right, but for most of you who are going to be watching this as a recording, when we hit that last grading point, it's not up to me about giving you an extension, right? You have to file for an incomplete or something like that. The grades are due, I believe, the Monday after, and so I have to grade everything, I have to submit it. So if you're waiting until the last minute and you email me and you're like, I will never say no, right? That's not really how I behave. If you ask me, I need help or I need this, I will say, okay, here's what you can do, but I'm going to be submitting grades at like 4 p.m. on Monday. So if it's not done by 4 p.m. on Monday, I have to submit grades. And so therefore, anything that's not done, if you submit it at 4:01, it's going to be too late for me to impact your grade because I've already submitted grades. And even if you submit it at 3:30, I may not have time to review it before I have to do a grade submission. So you have the next week, the next 7-8 days, to really get everything together. There's a ton of extra credit, way more than I've given in the past. There are the exams. Exam 2, if you did very poorly, right, I gave everyone 2 opportunities to take it. It sort of solved a technical problem that I was having, but if you need to go back, the paper, right, I only have about 5 papers, which means I need about 20 more, and it's due today, which might also explain why I have had, well, it doesn't, because I've always had low attendance, but right, get all of those things in if you're watching this recording, right, and up to that point, we're really going to be talking about how to get the best grade you can possibly get. So let's get back to the material. The first is ontology, right? You have an objective reality. right? That is just, I'm looking at the world and it is real, and I'm not going to take perception into account. I'm just going to account things. I'm going to look at what is available. This is, right, how many dollars, how many, right, how many deaths were there, what's the population size, how many votes were for each candidate, right? I'm going to do counting. I'm going to look at things that I believe to be real. The real world exists, and it exists despite our perception, right? The world just exists, right? And so that is one approach. And it's not that one approach is better than the other, it's that they do different things, because the next one is intersubjective reality. And the thing about intersubjective reality, it's what are the shared perceptions, right? Shared perceptions is intersubjective reality. And so this is, how much is our money worth, right? What is our currency actually worth? Yeah, we all have a $10 bill, but what is it worth? Because a $10 bill does not have the buying power it did in 1910, right? If you had a $10 bill, you could pay your rent, right, in 1910, right? Or a portion of your rent, right? That much more so than today. You could feed your family for a week. That's not possible on $10 today. I mean, some of you very much better than me at budget stretching, but right, $10 has a certain value that we've attached to it. And it could have a different value. And we've seen currencies of the world inflate and deflate, right? The peso used to be comparable to other currencies, and then it went through mega inflation, massive inflation for a few years. And so now it's 1,000 to 1 or 200 to 1, right? The exchange rate is dramatic. The same thing for other currencies, right? The Kuwaiti dinar is worth, 1 dinar is worth 3 times as much as $1. So currencies have value that is through perception. We share a perception in the value of a dollar. Right? That's intersubjective, right? We've agreed on a perception. And then subjective reality is this argument that our perceptions are not in alignment, right? And this has a lot to do when we talk about feminist theory, right? There's this argument that made by J.N. Tinkner, right? That the perspective of a female is not the perspective of a male, right? And they grow up differently. And so J.N. Tinkner's is a very good, clear argument, but it is much more nuanced because it happens in a lot subtler ways. It happens in a lot of ways that I just don't have an expertise in. And then when we talk about Charles Mills talks about it directly and uses examples. And I'm not saying it's better, it's just maybe clear for an instructional purpose, right? Charles Mills says that a black male will have a different perception because they will get used to being followed in stores. They'll get used to people crossing the street when they see them. And that continued perception changes how they see reality, right? They see more conflict and they see more contention when they're dealing with other people because other people react to them very differently, right? And not that I have any experience in being a minority or being a female or any case like that, right? But I am an older male, right? I am very accustomed to right, people crossing or moving away from me, right? Especially in a university, right? I'm obviously not an undergraduate student, right? And so people will typically keep their distance when I come in very early or when I stay very late, right? Because you're used to that, right? That as you reach a certain age, you're used to younger people sort of diverting away from it. That's a very normal thing, but that alters my perception as someone who's getting closer to middle age, right? While Charles Mills is talking about growing up and being black and male, right, and how that changed his perception, and then females, right? Jane is talking about females, and I'm talking about right, the sort of sex, not gender, right? Females who grow up, who are socialized, who right, and then see this very gendered, masculine male, right, behavior in political science, and they're like, you're not paying attention to that, and I see it because my perception is different. So subjective reality gives us a different aspect, and we talk about this as critical theory. And so each one of these ontologies, each one of these realities serves a different purpose, right? If you're doing statistics, you're in objective reality for the most part, right? You could be doing surveys. But if you're talking about a case study, you might be talking about intersubjective or subjective reality. So you need to know the different ontologies. There is some in epistemology how we understand the world, but there aren't a lot of questions. So while it's important to learn right now, it's not going to be a big part of the exam because we want to take some time to talk about methodology. So methodology, the big difference I want you to understand is quantitative uses numbers and qualitative uses characteristics. So I'm going to ask you questions about, okay, which one would be appropriate, and it's really a matter of what you're looking at, right? The ontology. If you're an objective reality, maybe quantitative would be better, right? Not necessarily, but it's more likely. Statistics, counts, thin analysis. This thin versus thick I've talked about a bit, right? So you should know what it means to be thin analysis versus thick analysis. Remember, they're all multiple choice questions, So there should be a clear best answer. There might be two good answers, but there should be a clear best answer. So use your best judgment when you're looking at the exam. Okay, which answer fits with the slides, with the lectures that have been discussed? Not with fits what I've, if you Google experiment, you're gonna get something very different, right? That's why I don't ask people to write what is an experiment, because they're gonna Google it and they're gonna get something very, very different that doesn't even align with what political science says an experiment is, right? They're gonna get Google's definition of an experiment, which is deeply flawed from this methodology perspective, right? That it requires all of these controls, which aren't realistic when you're talking about a real population, right? A real group of people will never work very well in an experiment because you can't control everything in that experiment, because people will always find some way to act differently, right? If any of you have ever tried to manage a group of 10 or more people, you realize immediately things go awry because someone will come up with something unrealistic to do, or someone will do something you didn't expect, right? So, right, qualitative is quantitative, right? I want you to use these definitions. I want you to understand how we discuss thin versus thick analysis. I don't think I asked you very many questions about the independent variable, the dependent variable, but as long as you know the independent variable is the cause and the dependent variable is the effect, you should be fine. We don't really ask about monocausal or intermediate variables, don't worry about that, but you should know the difference between an independent and a dependent variable. And not that one can act freely, one is stuck, right? These terms have very clear meanings. One is a cause and one is an effect, right? If I push a ball, my hand moving is the cause, the ball rolling is the effect, right? Very, very clear relationship in independent and dependent variables. And they're assumed, right? And we'll talk about assumptions, right? For this, remember that often in society, we talk about assumptions being like, oh, we assume something and it gets us in trouble. No. In science, an assumption is something we say it is true, right? That doesn't mean it's universally true. That means it's true in all cases. We say, for my experiment, I'm going to assume these things to be true. I'm going to assume that people are rational, right? That they weigh the costs and the benefits of behaviors. I'm going to assume that there are countries that want to survive, right? It's a very normal assumption in political science that countries want to survive, not that they don't want to be formed into another political unit. They don't want to be conquered. We assume that, but we have seen that some states have formed larger unions, right? The European Union has a lot of political connections, right? But our assumption is that states want to have their own independence, right? And that we treat that as true. And if it's not true, then that creates a problem for us. But often what we're doing is we're saying, I'm going to treat this as true. And if it's not true, my theory won't work, right? I'm going to make this assumption, I'm going to treat this as true, and I'm sort of build a universe. And if the cases that I'm talking about don't fit in this universe, then my theory won't work, but that's fine, because what I am talking about is what's in the universe that I'm building, right? So often we talk about, like, oh, don't make assumptions. Well, assumptions have to exist because you can't look at countries without some sort of context, right? When we look at sub-Saharan Africa, one of the things we talk about is what's the role of colonialism, right? And we assume that being ruled by a colonial power has long-lasting impact on those states, right? But if it doesn't, right, that might change our research slightly, but we know that being under colonial rule is going to have impact, right? They literally moved the capital city to the coastline. That's going to have an impact, right? When your capital city is moved by a foreign power, it's going to change your behavior. And if your capital city was there for a reason, a historical reason, or a strategic reason, that's going to have a long-lasting impact, right? The fact that our capital, the United States capital, is on the East Coast has an impact on the West Coast. There's actually less federal government involvement on the West Coast because of distance, right? And over time, historically, the Western states have become more independent, and the Midwestern states have been more independent because they're so far away, and it wasn't until the 20th century that the East Coast could really have an impact on Western states, right? And so that behavior is different, right? So we have to understand those, and those assumptions are just things that we treat as true. We say, this is true for this argument that I'm making, and if it's not true, then I'm not talking about those cases. Okay, science has to be falsifiable and repeatable, right? If there's no way to disprove your argument, then it's not scientific, right? And I don't mean that there is an actual way where your argument is wrong. I mean, if you're like, I won't take any critiques, that's not science, right? Science is, I am always open to critique, because if there's something wrong with my theory, I want to know so I can modify my theory, so my theory can be better and repeatable. If someone else looks at your cases and does similar research, they should come up with similar results, right? Not the exact same result, because we are talking about real populations and real countries, but similar, right? That's why we get this theta, Scotchbowl versus Geddes argument, because they do very similar things, but one is looking at Latin America and one is looking at Europe. And because of that, right, there's this argument is it really repeatable, or did Barbara Geddes include something that Scotchbowl didn't, and they're not the same research, right? And it's a good scientific question, but this minimum is just falsifiable and repeatable. Abstraction is this where you take away from reality, you move away from reality. I do want you to know what abstraction is. I'm pretty sure there's a question. As you're moving away from reality, you're like, I'm not going to treat states as like case studies, right? Case study is the most reality, right? That's the most like reality. I'm going to look at this state and exactly how it works. But if you take a step back into statistics, you're like, I'm going to turn all of the characteristics of that state into numbers, right? Obviously, that's an abstraction. That's a move away from reality so that you can generalize, right? That's the trade-off, right? The more abstract, the more you can generalize. The more specific, the less you can generalize. And that trade-off does exist, right? Okay, and that is that slide. Let's see what we get here. Nope, that's not what I wanted. Hold on one second. Okay. So the next thing is the first reading we did. Great, okay. Right, we talked about an experiment versus a comparison, right? Experiments don't really work in political, especially in comparative politics, because you can't put an entire state, right? There's ethical questions, there's normative questions, right? And there are empirical questions, right? And so we don't do a lot of experiments because it doesn't really fit, right, with a country. You can't make an entire state. Okay, hold on. Sorry, I did mute some of you, right? I think some of you forget that your background mics are on, or that like I can hear you in the background. So we go to the thin and thick analysis, right? We've talked about this a lot. I don't want to spend a lot of time. And there's this very clear table. So make sure that you're checking this out, right, as you're going through the exam, right? It's a very clear table about what is thick versus thin analysis. There are some questions on this. Make sure you understand the difference between thick and thin analysis, right? And just these tables are very clear. So if you get a question, just make sure you go back through. And if you're watching this video as you're taking it, because you can have the exam window open for a long time if you're like, oh, I'm not sure about this. And I didn't do one question at a time. So it's all there. All 60 questions will be there. Go through, answer the questions you're sure about, sort of whittle down till you're down to 2 questions, and you're like, oh, I know we talked about this, right? You can do the exam review, you can do the slides, you can find the answer. I promise you the answer to every question is in my lectures and in my slides. There's no way that it's not, right? I wrote these slides, I wrote the questions, they're all connected. All right. We do talk about knowledge theory, right? I don't really want you to know exactly what a theory is. I do want you to know it's not a hypothesis, right? A hypothesis is different from a theory, right? And some people, when they say, I have a theory, that's not really a theory, right? The social use of a lot of these terms is not expected. So if you Google these terms, or if you're like, what's the social, how do people say them in everyday life? That's always going to be the wrong answer, right? Don't just sort of, when you're going through the exam, if you're like, oh, what do people normally do in life? That's not gonna work, right? In any society, their treatment of science is gonna be deeply flawed, right? People almost always, when they talk to me about science, are wrong, right? Anytime someone's like, this is how science works, it starts wrong, right? It's almost always wrong. So don't try and take what's there. Look at what are the lectures and the slides that have been covered. Look at the scientific method, right? Go through those things. And if you're not sure about a term, don't Google search it, because you will get the wrong answer, right? Because the Google search is going to use, right, a definition, a dictionary definition, and that's the most common parlance, right? That's how the most common usage of that term, and that's just going to be flawed. I do want you to know what an epistemic community is, and that's just the scientific community that's dealing with that issue, right? Those are just the scientists and the authors that have the largest names and the biggest influence. And one of the things that happens is we talked about the Chicago School. I don't expect you to know the Chicago School. I'm using this as an example. They sort of became economists, and they said, this is how the best way to grow an economy. And it turns out they were largely wrong, right? But they had designed it so well that it made sense, right? That it was a strong academic argument. It just didn't really fit with reality, right? The authors of what we call supply side economics, what most people call trickle down economics or Reaganomics, right? They made a very valid, logical argument. It just didn't work, right? It did not work, right? Trickle down economics doesn't work, right? And that's not me being partisan, right? It just doesn't work, right? We have all of the research in. Trickle down economics doesn't work. It doesn't lead to growth, economic growth, right? It does lead to deficits, right? We've seen this over and over, right? And why do I know this? Because Reagan did it in the 1980s. We've had so much time to study what he did, right? And we don't have economic growth in the 80s, and then we switch to a Keynesian approach in the 90s, and we do have economic growth, right? So the epistemic community, the group of scientists and advisors, really has a lot of influence. All right. We've talked about this. I want you to understand the different types of comparative politics. The biggest is a case study. A single case study or a small number of cases, what we call small n, right, is important. Right? There's also classification, right? You can do as democracies or just look at authoritarian regimes, right? And then you can look at, I want to look at African politics, right? This is often called regional studies, right? I might just want to look at the Middle East and North Africa, right? You might want to region, and then the largest is its world systems, right? And that's dependency theory, democratic peace theory, right? How does the world work, right? And typically when we start talking about how the world works, we get into IR. So we're not going to see a lot of world systems theory in this course because international relations, which is actually political science 231, that's going to talk about those aspects, right? So we really want to focus on case studies and regional studies, right? You should know those things. You should know how a case study works, right? You should know how a case study works, right? That it's a very detailed description. It looks at the institutions, the regimes, all of the characteristics that are relevant for a political science case study of a given state, right? And we've seen this, right? We've talked about this. We talked about South Korea. We talked about a couple of other cases. We talked about France and England, right? How they developed, right? And how that's different from sort of China and Russia and Brazil and other cases, right? And so we didn't do a lot of case studies only because there's a lot of detail that I could ask you, but it's so minor details that you wouldn't know what to pick up, right? And here I want you to know what's important. And some of you won't remember specific case studies, but you'll remember the theories, and it'll be easier for you to process case studies in the future if you are a political science major. I don't need that. Typology is not something we're going to really ask a lot of questions about. Regional statistical analysis, that's not a question. Whenever we talk about statistics, the only thing I really want you to know is it's quantitative. Anytime we use the word statistics, that's a quantitative approach, right? We're using numbers and regression analysis as a quantitative approach, and it really typically only fits in an objective ontology, but there are examples where it doesn't, right? If you do surveys and you turn those survey responses and people answer you and you turn them into numbers, you're actually taking a qualitative research program and turning it into a quantitative analysis, right? And that's possible, and surveys make sense, right? We want to know what people think. That's the arbitrary split. I'm not worried about that. We have talked about different times. So until 1945, right, from sort of that, as we go through the industrial era until World War II, the biggest change before and after World War II, right, this sort of 1945 to 1950 change, depending on the author we're talking about, is that colonization ends, right, colonial powers end, right, and all of these states become independent. So from the beginning of time until 1945, we have states controlling other states. From 1950 to 1992, what we have is the Cold War period, right? The Cold War period. And during the Cold War period, we know that the United States and the Soviet Union, they didn't really care about domestic policy. They only cared, are you a capitalist democratic society or are you a communist society, right? Those were the options. And so a lot of other behavior, how do you develop, right? Do you have different trade relations? They didn't care because they were busy with other things. And then after 1992 is the post-Cold War era, right? And that is very different because the United States starts getting really involved in the behavior of other states. It starts really caring about trade relationships, and it starts telling the world that it needs to be involved in what is called comparative advantage, right? This becomes, now the Chicago School is older than that, but during the Cold War it was all about containment. After the Cold War it was about influence, right? Still democratization, but also opening trade doors. Right, and then we talked about the tigers, right? South Korea is one of those what they called Asian tigers, Southeast Asian tigers. The thing that they did that was noteworthy was Japan, Korea, Vietnam to an extent, and the Philippines, right? They used ISI, import substitution industrialization, to use labor to build up another industry, most likely automobile manufacturing, and then develop that industry before opening it up to trade, right? And then when they did open trade, it was able to compete in the international market, right? So that is the big thing about those cases. And then we did talk a little bit about elite theory, but elite theory is not that different from contract theory, right? So elites working with the government is more about contract theory, right? You do something for me, I'll do something for you. You can raise taxes, but you have to provide me with these services. You can be elected, but you have to give me certain patronage jobs of my community, right? My community has to get certain patronage jobs. Right, that elite theory and elite fracture are connected. And then elite fracture, remember, this is going to be that Scotch pull and Geddes argument, right? We're going to talk about this a bit, right? You start with sort of an elite fracture, and then you have autonomy and all these other factors, and it leads to social revolution, right? And I want you to know that process, but we're going to go over it in just a second. Okay, so... I know I'm jumping a bit, but I apologize for the delay. I'm fixing the I'm just fixing the YouTube video, just so they can see the slides as we're going. So then we get into this Monk and Snyder piece. One of the things is I do want you to understand the data that they're using, right? So this is the very first slide. They're using journal articles, what was in the journal articles, that's their data. They're saying, here's what's in the journal articles. And hold on, I don't think this is actually being shared. So they're using the journal articles. Right, that's the data that they're using. There's definitely a question about the data. They're just using the journal articles. They're reviewing what journals are covering. That's the data. They discuss the role of a paradigm. Now, we're not going to have questions about paradigms. I don't want you to worry about paradigms. Paradigms is something that's covered very well in 231. If you have 231 with me or someone else who has an IR focus, you're going to spend weeks and weeks talking about what a paradigm is, what are the dominant paradigms. I don't want you to worry about that. You should know what rational choice is. We've talked about it enough, right? Rational choice is just you're trying to seek the maximum amount of rewards. So you just weigh the costs and the benefits, and you go for the thing that has the most benefits, right? That the most reward, right? That, okay, I can win $100 if I bet $1, right? But the odds of me winning are 1,000,000 to 1. So I'm not going to bet that dollar because it's unlikely that I'll come out better off than I did in the first place, right? And so while we do know that people gamble, right, it's not necessarily irrational behavior. It's that the idea of winning money has value in itself, right? The hope and the value of, oh, I might win $1 million, it has its own value, which is why what casinos are built around, right? You have the chance that you could change your life by winning this prize. And so people bet more than they should economically because it gives them some other hope or some other gesture, right? And so, right, gambling is always this problematic thing to explain in rational choice, right? But I expect you to know what rational choice it is. I don't worry about grand theory versus policy relevant. I don't ask you that. Policy relevance is something for political science majors we'll talk about in other courses, in your 304 level courses if you're a political scientist. We're going to talk a lot about, is this academic paper or is this a policy relevant paper, right? Is this something that decision makers can actually do something with? And they don't all have to be, but given that is not going to be on the exam. That's not important. I mean, it is important, but it's not on the exam. We have talked about a mixed method approach, right? This is where you do case studies and then you do a statistical analysis. And in my mind, this is actually the best way to go about it, but it's a lot of work without a lot of payout, right? So sometimes you just don't have work to put in, right? In this course, right, one of the things is you're only going to put as much work in as you need to get the grade that you want, right? I don't expect you to be spending 10 hours a week on this course, right? I don't want you to do that. Right? What I do want you to do is spend 4 or 5 hours a week outside of lectures, right, which is the 2-to-1 that we normally use, right, for every 3 units of 3 hours of in class, you should be doing about 6 hours of out of class work, right? So I kind of want you to keep something similar to that, but I don't want you to spend 10 hours, it's not worth it to you, right? And so when we're talking about research, one of the things is it worth it to do all these case studies so that you can understand the picture better, so you can regression analysis can be better. If you're talking about Sub-Saharan Africa, you do need to understand the context, right? But if you're talking about Europe, the data really does represent the states very well because it's designed by Western Europe, right? If you design the system and the characteristics that are going to be quantified, then it's most likely going to fit with your states, right? Whereas other places, the Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, right? Maybe those things don't work as well because you need to look at the context of those cases. We've talked about area studies. I'm not worried about the economic term. I know I'm going quickly, but I don't want to cover anything that I know is not on the exam. Right? That's not fair to you. And a lot of this you're going to be going over as you go through to sort of get the right answer. I just want to be clear about it. Okay, that is that one. The big question there is what is the data, and it's what articles are in the journals. I don't know why, but I thought I had set this up better, but the YouTube's not being, the video I'm creating is not being bothered, so I apologize that there's all these like stop and starts. I just want to go over the actual material I cover to make sure that we're on the same page, right? So we talk more about a case study, right? This idea that it's positivist. Right? Positive just means that the world can be constructed. We can observe things. We can look at cause and effect relationships, right? Science, hard sciences, what we call chemistry, biology, physics, these are hard or natural sciences. They are positivists, right? They could look at the world and that world could be observed and we could look at cause and effect relationships. Now, one of the reasons why this might be flawed when we talk about political science is we're dealing with humans. And the behavior you see of them is not the behavior that maybe their intent is, right? And this is the most obvious example I use because I have worked in customer service, and I'm sure many of you have worked in customer service. Often, when you see someone working in customer service and they're having a really bad day, they'll be interacting with the customer in a very positive manner, right? They'll be very friendly, they're very positive. That's not connected to how their feelings, their beliefs, their thoughts, right? And we know this because when they get off of work, when they move away from customers, the behavior changes radically. And so this is why the positivist view is harder to apply to humans, because humans will often behave one way for a reason that's not connected to their beliefs and their values, right? If you walk into any restaurant that serves an older crowd, you will see a lot of waitresses, especially female waitresses, who have to deal with comments, and they will smile a lot when a comment is made, even if that comment is inappropriate, because their connection is to tips, not to whether or not they're defending themselves, right? But when they leave away from that community, when they go get the food or something, their facial expression changes, right? They go through this whole process. And so what you see on the surface is not accurate, right? Then positivist approaches are very difficult. And to tie this into comparative politics, in 1989, there was a survey going around by the Soviet states, by the Western Soviet states, right? The states that were from the Caucasus region, Ukraine, places like that. Right? The sort of westernmost part of the Soviet Union, and they all said that they wanted to be in the Soviet Union. And then in 1999, they all seceded, right? So between 6 months, they said, we all want to stay, and then they all seceded from the Soviet Union. Well, what was happening? Well, if you said you didn't want to be part of the Communist Party, you didn't want to be part of the Soviet Union, you might get killed, you might get murdered, you might get arrested, you might get a whole host of things. And so there was an incentive to misrepresent. And so a positivist view is more difficult to apply to a person and to a population because they often misrepresent for very good reasons, right? If someone asked you during Nazi Germany whether or not you were Jewish, you might lie to them to save your own life, right? And that would be perfectly acceptable because we would understand why you're doing it scientifically, but we'd also normatively not want you to die, right? One of the norms that we do have is we don't want people to die, right? We don't want them to die. And so for them to behave in a way that helps their survival, of course that makes sense in a scientific perspective, right? From a scientific perspective, especially a political science perspective. We're not going to talk about the postmodern view. This is a subjective or an intersubjective ontology, but this has some other meaning that we don't really get into, that you'll get into in other courses if you're a political science major. We talked about the depth, right? Thick versus thin analysis, quantitative versus qualitative. Quantitative is thin, qualitative is thick, right? They both have value, and I expect you to know the sort of differences between them. This is a note, right? The readings are saying the same things. You should see them a lot. My lecture is repetitive. The research is repetitive. We're always talking about the same thing, right? If you notice, Scotch-Bone Geddes' arguments are coming up a lot, and we're still going to cover them. So a case study is just one state that we look at in context. An observation can be something where we're looking at, okay, the observation is the state, or the observation is one factor about the state, right? An observation could be a number of different things, right? What do I mean by an observation? Do I mean a specific variable, like we were looking at the population, we were looking at a specific state, right? What is an observation? It can have different meanings. So what meaning am I implying by the question? Let's make sure to look at that. We don't talk a lot about counterfactual analysis. There are some clear steps to how it works, but there may be one question, but just remember that you need to limit as many things as you can, right? Limit the least amount of variables. Change one thing about history, and then follow the logic of what would happen, right? Don't guess, right? Think about what theories exist. Think about what cases have been like that, right? And so, okay, I'm going to make this one change, and what do the theories predict that behavior would be, right? Try to limit assumptions as much as possible. Try to limit guessing, right? Make sure that you're following the theories about how behavior would occur, right? But as far as like listing them out, that's not going to be in a multiple choice question. We talked a lot about agreement and difference, right? Similarities versus differences in their value, but there may be only at most one question. We do talk about probabilistic versus deterministic a lot, so I want you to know the difference, right? Deterministic says if I have these factors, this outcome is definitely going to occur. Probabilistic is it's more likely to occur, right? If I'm on a planet that has gravity, right, and all planets have gravity, right, and I hold something and I let go of it, it's going to fall down. That's deterministic, right? That gravity is going to pull that towards the surface of the Earth, right? That is just going to happen, right? It's a direct relationship, right? Direct causal relationship. Probabilistic is if I give you more and more extra credit, you're more likely going to pass this course, right? But I've given out a lot of extra credit. There's still 2 or 3 people who are likely going to fail the course because they haven't done any of it, right? I have made the opportunities available, but they're not there. And I'm not trying to harp on you or make you feel bad. That's not the point. The point is I could give you 300% possible extra credit and keep offering more and more opportunities to improve your grade. There are going to be students who still don't pass because they're not even taking this course anymore. They're sort of disconnected, right? And there might be a whole host of justifiable reasons for that to occur that I could talk to the student, but it still won't change the fact that some people, no matter how much, that it's only a likelihood. And we'll get to a point where it's 99% likely, but even if it's 99% likely, if I have 100 students, that means one student is still going to fail, right? And so probabilistic is not the same as deterministic. I don't need you to know regression analysis. I would not, process tracing might come up once, and I really just want you to know it's the chronological order of events, but I wouldn't worry too much about that. There are always trade-offs. Remember that you need to know these trade-offs. What are the trade-offs? What are the benefits versus the costs of everything? But this is something that we've talked about enough that it's sort of a larger concept that's going to occur in a lot of slides. And then I don't need you to worry about those. Hold on. Okay. We talked about the method of disagreement, method of difference, right? These aren't that complicated, but I think there's only one question about them, right? There might be two, but not more than two. I wouldn't worry about too much about that. Case selection. Case selection is what we're going to talk about a lot, right? How do you select the cases? Do you select on the dependent variable? Do you select on cases of interest or certain regions, right? Do I want to look at Southeast Asia? Do I want to look at cases that are democracies? Do I want to look at cases with resource wealth, right? We have the Wright and Geddes article about oil rents and how that changes behavior, right? Are those the cases that I want to look at, right? There are a lot of reasons to choose different cases, right? Know a few of them, and remember it's here on the Peters chapter 2 slides about this. I'm not going to ask you about the structure of the scientific revolution, although if you're a political scientist, you're going to eventually read this book. I would look into it, just sort of reviewing it. The argument's fairly simple, but it is something that eventually you will need to know, but only if you're a political science major. If you're not a political science major, right, the understanding of how science changes and sort of collapses and a new system emerges might be helpful, but I don't expect you to know that. Diffusion is something I do want you to know, but we're going to talk about that later as well, right? It's going to come up a few times. Diffusion is just shared ideas, but it's not government to government, right? This is just people talking, and in their conversations, they mention something about their life, and another person says, oh, I like that, or I get why that would be useful. And then they take that to their population, right? Say they're going to school overseas, when they come back, they bring this thing in, right? This is how a lot of norms and values change, right? This is a very normal process that the people that you talk to today, right, hopefully as we get out of this and we get back into the classrooms, one of the things that normally happens in a college that you're sort of being robbed of is you're in a classroom and you start talking to people in the classroom and you start talking to people your age and you're more willing to accept their values and their norms because they're closer to you in age and similarity and context, right? You're all students in a classroom, and you start talking about what is right and wrong and all these things, and you start to define those things through your interactions, right? One of the things that we don't see as much as saying bless you. It's one of the things that used to be very, very common that's happening slightly less, but it's not because people are rude, because its foundations are religious, right? And its meaning is there, right? The other thing is holding the door for others. Now, this is one of the things that we have seen a change this year, and especially last year, is not holding, because you're supposed to be distancing, right? And so our norms are changing through a diffusion process. You see people keeping their distance from you. It used to be a very rude thing to stay 6 feet away from each other, right? That's very rude to keep that amount of distance. But now it's the accepted norm, right? We want to keep that amount of distance. And if people get you close to you, you're like, hey, we need to distance out. And so our norms change, and that's a diffusion process where you interact with people and build those norms. We're not going to ask very much about globalization. It's more of an IR term anyways. Unit of analysis is the individual, the community, or the society, and then global, right? And I do want you to know the difference between the level of your analysis. Emergent properties is something that's much harder that I'm not going to ask about, only because if you're a biologist, you're going to learn about this. If you're a political science, you're going to learn about this. But each group is going to teach emergent properties differently, and I don't want to sort of teach you bad habits that you have to unlearn as you move forward. And if you become a political scientist, this understanding of emergent properties is handled in different ways depending on the type of political scientist you become. We talked a lot about sub-Saharan Africa, right? Colonial rule, state formation, right? The borders were not created by the state, they were created by a foreign power, so they're very straight. They separate populations, right? They're not homogeneous populations. They don't have national identity. All of these things matter. We talked about dependency theory at the very end, so it's important that you know dependency theory. There are going to be questions. That's not helpful. So we're going to talk about selection bias in the next slide. And there are a lot of ways of making an argument that's not as valid because you're making mistakes, right? Instrument bias is something that we do have a question about, right? Are you looking at, right, the same metrics, right? And the most obvious example is anthropologists in the beginning of the 20th century were all male. They just were all male because they were the only ones sort of allowed to be in that role. And so they would go to states and they'd be like, oh, women aren't involved in politics. Well, the reason they thought that is because they weren't allowed to talk to women, right? They had segregated societies based on sex. So the male researchers couldn't speak to the female population, and so they assumed that the female population was involved. When in fact the female population was very involved, they just weren't communicating with those researchers, right? And that's instrument bias, right? The way you're looking at a research, right? And that's a political science measure. The most obvious example is a scale, right? If your scale's off by 5 pounds, you're going to get some things that are wrong because your scale's always off by 5 pounds, right? That's systematic error. And then selection bias is where you're getting some answer that's wrong because you're excluding cases, and that exclusion is causing a problem. And we're going to talk about that a lot in the next section. So let's get rid of this. Sorry, the computer's starting to slow down. I need to close some stuff. And if you, hopefully I'm not going too fast, but also I still have quite a bit to do and we're running out of time. I'm probably not going to review the very last sections because we just did a video on that, but other than that, we should be fine. All right, so social revolutions occur and they follow a very specific path. And right, a social revolution is a transformation of society, right? So it's a complete regime change. There's a political and a social aspect. The parts that I want you to know, right? Yes, they do case studies that it's France, Russia, and China. It's process tracing. It's structural. So remember, this is a deterministic argument. It should follow, right? If you have these things, that you should end up. So we've talked about existing theory a little bit, right? There's Marxist theory. There's Tedgar frustration, what we call relative deprivation. These are things that will come up several times in political science, right? Tedgar actually taught for 1 semester here. But his impact is very strong because of his argument about frustration. And his book is called Why Men Rebel, right? That was very influential, but it's a few decades old now. All right, so what are the requirements to sort of have this? And I really want you to go through this process, right? Right, it's a structural perspective. There is an impact by international systems, and there has to be some coercive aspect of the state, right? If the state doesn't have a coercive capacity, it doesn't matter because it can't stop the change, right? The changes that occur, these social revolutions occur in spite of a coercive capacity because of this change, right? We don't really talk about a purposive image. A purposive image is where I show you an example and I'm trying to do something with that example, but may not apply to other cases. But we don't have a lot of questions about that. Don't worry about the international context right now. That's not something, like there's norm diffusion, but it's something else we'll talk about as we go through the slides. The types of state is not, I mean, there might be one question, but unlikely, right? But you can see the state as an arena where parties compete, or you can see the state as an autonomous structure, like a bureaucracy that's working on its own. Okay. And so, yeah, I don't like how this is, but okay. So the next part we're going to talk about is Geddes. And this Geddes article, what it's really giving us is, why is it doing that? Sorry, switching over to the YouTube, it's not very, like, the OBS software just doesn't always, like, work. Okay, or I don't know how to use it. More than likely, I don't use it. So now we're talking about selection bias. And this is going to be a lot about Geddes' argument. And so here's the thing, is when you pick the cases on the dependent variable, you only show what they have in common. You don't show what differences might occur. And so selection on the dependent variable is one way to create selection bias, right? It's a very problematic way. If you say, I'm only going to deal with cases that have this outcome, you're likely going to have some selection bias problems. But what I want you to know is, yes, selection bias is one of the things that can happen, right? That you have to worry about selection bias because there is going to be a question about how selection bias occurs, right? And so you need to know, is it because you're selecting on the dependent variable? Is it because your assumptions are off? Is it because, right, that you're a measurement error, right? But what's important here is that when we're going through this, right, you need to know ISI, and then, right, a random sample is something you'll talk about in statistics. I'm not worried about that. The The variables in this specific case aren't as important as this part. This is the part that I really want you to get. Geddes and Skocpol explain a path-dependent argument, and it happens in order, and all the steps have to be there, right? You have to have all the steps in there. So you have to have an external military threat, right? You have to have some state saying, we've beaten you in a military fight and you're in trouble, or we can beat you. And so it causes a threat. And so the elites that exist, they start to say, okay, well then we need to change. We need to survive, right? Because all the states want to survive. And so elites start saying, you need to make these changes so we don't get conquered by another state. And so they call for reforms, and those reforms don't get accepted because the dominant class, whoever's in power, they're like, no, if we go through these reforms, I'm not going to stay in power. So I don't know if it's worth it to risk being conquered if it means I have to, right? If I have to give up power and that stops us being conquered, then there's no benefit for me because either way I lose power. That my elite group loses power. And so then you have an elite fracture and a revolution, right? And so there's a very clear path-dependent argument. And so one of the things that is completely necessary, one of the things that is very necessary is when you have this elite fracture, right, you always need an elite fracture for a social revolution. You need some elites. But the other part is that you need an autonomous group, right? And just because I know, hold on one second. Right, you need an autonomous population. And all that means is a group of people not daily supervised, right? And not that I need you to memorize this meaning, but remember, if you're a landowning elite and you don't check on your population, they have time to organize. They can talk about what they want to do, right? Autonomy is very, very important in a number of different arguments. Skocpol says you need autonomy, a populist autonomy, right? That they need to be free to interact in their daily lives for a social revolution to occur. Geddes agrees that you need to have this autonomy. Many of the other authors agree. So that is something that is going to be important that we're going to see come up again. Right? I don't know why I didn't, okay. So villages not supervised by the landlord, right? And then the elites that don't want to be part of the dominant party, they go and pick up these groups. They help them mobilize, right? They say, okay, well, we'll start calling for things. And then when they get into power, they might take some of the normative calls. They might add more freedom. They might add more protections for the public, right? But what they're really trying to do is gain power, so those elites gain power and realign the agreements so the new elite group that sort of came into power off the mobilized population, right, they can get better resources. They can get more rents from the state. They can get more money and privileges and resources from the state through the new government that they form. I'm not worried about deviant cases, something you cover in statistics. Remember that Geddes talks about South America, the South and Latin America, right? And how it's different, right? The behavior is different, it doesn't fit. And our argument is that there's a problem with Skocpol's theory because it selects on revolutions. And if you look at larger cases, her data doesn't support Skocpol's argument. Right? And so this is what Geddes critiques, is that you're looking at it the wrong way and it's causing selection bias. And if you took a random sample, it wouldn't really fit, your theory really wouldn't fit with social revolution, right? That's what's really important between Skocpol and Geddes. All right. Save that. I'm gonna go for about I'm going to go for a little bit longer. We're on Geddes, so, okay, good. Sorry, this computer is very slow, so. One second. So we'll do regimes for about 10 minutes and then we'll take a break and we'll come back at 10 and I'll post the video. Okay, so polyhierarchy's up there. So we talked about polyarchy, right? The polyarchies are the underlying component of democracy. Right? We see, one of the things I want you to know is how do we go from what democracies, right? Because the Greeks thought that only small city-states could be democracies, right? Because then everyone can be involved, right? If you have 200 people, you can all get together and discuss what you want your rules to be. As you get really big, that's impossible. So they thought, right, ancient Greeks thought, no, it's not possible to have a large democracy. You can only have small city-states. But as we grow, we had democracies. We had this historic shift. Well, one of the things is that we had these national groups, right, or ethnic groups, and they all came together in some way that they could sort of have the same values and principles, and so then they could have representatives that could come together, and then you could start to have a democracy, right? And so when you have these larger scales, you start to have indirect representation, right? Indirect representation is where we elect someone who then goes to Congress for us. Direct representation is you go to City Hall and you say, this is what I want, right? And so we have indirect representation, right? Senators and Congress people and right mayors and city council. The other part is unlimited extension. You start having it where everyone can be represented. Everyone can have a vote, everyone can have a say, but they have limits on their participation. Not everyone is going to have a say on the new bills that President Biden proposed on Wednesday, right? Not everyone's going to have a say, but we have representatives who will influence that, right? Our representatives will influence that. And we'll see that our influence, right, our demands as a public will start to influence the behavior of Congress, right? It does to a point, right? But there are limits on what we can do. Now, as you extend, we're going to be diverse, right? And diversity is this language of homogeneous. Homogeneous means everyone in the group is basically the same or similar, and heterogeneous is where you have very different groups, right? And the most obvious example in the United States is homogeneous is a white population, right? And heterogeneous is a mixed population with other minorities, Asian minorities, black minorities, right? In the same administrative aspect, right? The same city, the same state, right? So your laws now have to apply to different groups, right? And you have rule of law, right? We're talking about a polyarchy. So rule of law means that the laws have to apply to everyone in the same way. And when you have something like that, trying to decide what the rules are can be very problematic, right? You have religious issues, right? The behavior of the United States has been connected to religious values historically, right? Why is it that Sunday was the first day we had off? Or why is it that Sundays are typically the day, right, where the weekend is set up Saturday, Sunday? Well, because most of the believers at the time when our week was set up, right, was set up in such a way that the weekend, right, carved out by unions, and that they were like, we're going to have a 5-day work way, but we're going to have a 2-day weekend ending with Sunday, right, the day of rest, right? And so this was a historical religious purpose. But if you weren't that religion, if you weren't a Christian religion, right, then it didn't really fit, right? Now, Abrahamic religions, right, that when the Seder is and when other holidays, right? But obviously that's not going to work with all religions, and so there's points of contention as you grow a society. There's also ideological, right? We did see this really big fight in the beginning of the 20th century between unions who wanted a 5-day work week, right? And corporate interests, right? What become corporate interests of saying, well, you should be working every day, right? We're more productive when we work every day, right? And this fight between a 7-day and a 5-day work week became this ideological difference between sort of a social democracy and a pure capitalist society, right? And these behaviors. And then, of course, occupational, right? If you're a laborer versus you're an academic versus you're a white collar worker versus you're an owner of a company, you're going to have these differences. And finally, ethnic versus and racial, right? That certain ethnic groups are going to have different behaviors, right? And those behaviors are going to be criminalized if they don't fit in with the norms of the majority of society. And when you have a heterogeneous group, this can be a problem, right? And the most obvious example is sort of the FDA, right? There's a lot of service of undercooked foods, where there's a lot of foods that are served and part of them is being undercooked or being served raw, and trying to get the laws to fit to understand what is safe, but also part of that culture, that business, right? So sushi is something that's very big in the United States, but it is highly regulated because while the food is safe, right, it's still raw. And so trying to make that distinction between saying, okay, normally it would require all meat to be cooked to 165 degrees, but you're serving it raw, how do you make sure that it's safe, right? And coming up with those rules and those behaviors become a problem that was solved, right? The United States, right, the laws that exist, sushi places have already sort of passed all those things, right? They're very standardized now, but it took time for that to come clear, and that conflict and that competition that exists, right, helps build a polyarchy and a democracy through that process, right? That diversity creates all of these things that happen. So there are 7 criteria, right? I want you to know the 7 criteria. I'm not actually going to go through them, but you need to know the 7 criteria, right? There are 7, they're listed. You should know them. It should be fairly easy for you to know them. We've covered them a lot. I don't want you to worry about the interpretations. I don't think there's any questions about that. They're at 1 at most. We've talked about pluralism. This is competition over ideas. It's not that complex, and we don't really spend a lot of time talking about it, right? Organization is part of the 5, right? That you should have a right. In the 7 criteria, one of them is you should have a right to join autonomous organizations. So the pluralism is that just I join an organization, I compete for certain aspects. I'm not worried about that. I do want you to know some negative aspects of pluralism, right? That groups in power and the majority are going to overrun the minority, right? This is going to happen a lot because they have more power to influence lawmakers. That does not mean that laws themselves create others. That means other people who want to create others influence lawmakers, right? It's not about the law, it's about the people, right? And so changing the law is actually quite easy, right? In all governments, it's very easy to change the law, but you have to get the people in power to be willing to change the law, right? So the differences are not about what the laws are, right? And one of the big fights that we know about, in not just in the United States, but in a lot of places, is sort of voting rights laws, right? This is not unique to the United States, and it's not unique to this year, but we will continue to fight about voting rights, how voting occurs, because some people want voting to be more difficult for strategic reasons, right? It's estimated that more Democrats are turning 18 every day than Republicans, right? And more Democrats are not becoming Republicans later in life, and so you are having a demographic shift. And so there might be a strategic region. There might be a racist reason, right? Depends on the bill that we're talking about, right? I don't want to say one bill is racist or not, right? Because I would have to get into specifics of the bill, and we just don't have time. It might be, right, that they believe that there's electoral fraud. Now, there's no evidence of widespread electoral fraud. I don't want to be one of those people that's associated with any of that, right? But we might have different reasons for those people introducing those bills. But the reasons they're introducing the bills is because their electorate, the people who voted for them, have expressed interest in those things, right? And we will continue to see those behaviors as long as that population is saying this is what we want, right? This is the things that we want. Organizations do fill a public role. I might ask you about an iron triangle, but it's very simple, right? It's sort of just a closed loop with the government, a government agency, a legislative committee, and a group of industry. This is also in Political Science 101, so you've heard about this before. And then, right, I'm sure I asked this question, so it can come up, right? Some of the questions I did reuse, so if you've heard them before, you'll see them again, right? You're like, why did I miss it last time, right? Think about it, right? Some of these questions are very similar, if not the same, right? The two things that Dahl adds to this, right? You need polyarchy, you need pluralism, and then you need some limits on power. That can be a Bill of Rights, that can be checks and balances. You need some limit on authority of different organizations so that you can make sure that everyone has a chance to compete. Right, that is polyarchy. We spent a lot of time talking about Levitsky and Way. We're not going to spend too much time now talking about it because we spent a lot of time talking about it in the past. There are videos. I want you to know, right? It's the post Cold War era they're talking about. So this is right after. That's not the right thing. That's paper submissions. It's right after the Cold War. So this is an opportunity for states to sort of proliferate, right? You have all these independent states. The United States is saying, we'll help you in your transition, but you have to be a democracy. And so a lot of these states start building a facade of democracy, right? And so they go from single party rule where one group is in power, they might be elected, but they're the only group, they're the only party that's allowed to be in power, to where opposition parties are allowed. There are state resources that are allotted by policy, not by patronage or personal networks, right? And people can run for office, right? It's competitive, but it's this idea of an uneven playing field, right? And Levitsky and Way's big contribution is this uneven playing field, right? That you always have incumbent advantage. Every incumbent has special advantages, right? They might be able to give away certain projects to groups that they like, right? They might be able to hire someone that supported their campaign. They might be serving the interests of just their group, right? That it is definitely true that in the past, senators have only served the groups that have supported them, right? People who are very connected to the NRA and are supported by the NRA, that's a clientelist network that they've created, right? The NRA supports them, they stay in power, they pass policies that support the NRA. I think the NRA went bankrupt, but in that time, right, before the 1990s, probably the 1980s going into the 2010s, right, the NRA had a lot of influence. It was this clientist network. And they had privileged access. If you're the president, everyone wants you to be on their TV show. Everyone wants the president, no matter who it is, they want them to come on because the president, every time the president says something, it becomes a part of the policy, right? Everything's said, right? One of the things, not to add this, just throw this in, but Biden said that we have the power to cure cancer, as we know it, right? He said that, right? That creates a huge behavior change by people. The expectation now is if he doesn't make improvements in cancer research, by the time the next election occurs, people are going to say, why did you say that if you couldn't hold up, right? He just put himself very vulnerable in that position, right? So of course we want them on TV, because every time they say something, it either becomes fodder for the opposition, or it's something that's policy that we can hold them accountable for, right? And so we have to make sure that we understand these are normal incumbent advantages. The difference between normal incumbent advantages and an uneven playing field is when you take those advantages to the extreme. You say, only my party could be on TV. Only my networks are going to be served, right? If you're not in the networks that we have, you just won't be served at all. All of my earmarks will go to a company that I own or that people that I like own, right? Those are the extremes when you get an uneven playing field, right? They even have free and fair elections, right? There's not as much manipulation of the elections. There's just so much uneven playing field that people stay with the party that's in power with the incumbents because they're helped out the most. We have talked about legal repression. There are questions about legal repression. This slide's particular, this section right here, I hope it's coming up on both sides, okay. I want you to understand, because I think there's like 3 questions about this. Legal repression is where you say, you didn't pay your taxes, so we're going to take your property. But we're going to claim you didn't pay your taxes, and we're going to say that we're going to manipulate the documents just enough to where it looks like you didn't pay your taxes in the right way. Or we're going to find some loophole that you took advantage of that you shouldn't have, some mistake that you made and say, oh, well, you made a mistake and you actually owe $1 million, and we found it a year later, so we're going to seize $1 million worth of property. We're going to seize this, right? Or we're going to claim that you lied about something. Even though you didn't, if you say, oh, that person murdered someone, and right, one of the claims that right, Putin, right, many people in Russia will say, well, Putin had Navalny, the opposition leader, killed, right? You can be sued. That could be slander. You say, where's your proof? And if there's no proof, you're saying something that's maliciously false, right? And so you can use these libel and slander laws to get rid of people, to censor people, right? And if you're aggressive enough saying, I'm going to sue anyone who says something bad about me, because if they don't have proof, I say it's a lie and then I have them arrested, what you'll have is people censoring themselves. So defamation laws are a very important part of this. Tax repression is all part of legal repression. And I want you to know that aspect because I asked you at least 3 questions. I don't know how they're going to come up, but there are a number of questions that you're going to be asked about it. We've talked about this uneven playing field a lot, and I feel like we're sort of running out of time, so I want to make sure I give you a 15-minute break and cover as much as possible because I need a break to get some water. So there is a question about uncertainty. Remember that if you are in a dictatorship, you know who's going to win the election because only one person can win. So that's low uncertainty. You're sure about what's going to happen, low uncertainty. In a democracy, the outcome should be high uncertainty, right? We have a very clear example here in the United States. The week after the presidential election in last November, there was so much uncertainty. We weren't sure how Georgia and Pennsylvania and Even here in Nevada, right, there are a number of states that just didn't come up with clear answers right away, and it would change the outcome, right? Because of the way the votes are counted, right? That's why so many people have made arguments that there might be an issue. Now, there are a lot of other factors. There's way more mail-in votes. There's way more votes that came in, right? That we had a significant increase in voting. We had, and none of these suggest that there is more fraud. There's no suggestion of that. But what we do see is we have a lot more people voting than we did last time, and we don't know how they're going to vote because they didn't vote last time, right? The biggest predictor of how they're going to vote is how did they vote last time. But they didn't vote last time. We just have more voters. And so in a democracy, when you have this really high uncertainty, that's actually a sign of a good democracy because we don't know the outcome. Both sides were competitive. It was possible for both a Republican and a Democratic candidate to win. And as we were counting the votes, we got a little more certainty. But on the first day, it was like, we have no idea who's going to win the election, right? We have no idea who's going to actually come through in this, right? And as the votes are counting in, it becomes clearer and clearer, but a high uncertainty in democracies because the competitive elections. Because as votes are coming in, it's not a predetermined outcome. You're not sure what's going to happen. This is their justification for explaining why they introduce a new term. There are 3 paths, so don't worry as much about the international order. There are a few things there, but we're going to talk about them when we come back from the break. There are a few paths that I want you to know, right? That you can go from a stable to unstable regime. You can go from a competitive authoritarian regime to a democratic regime, and you can stay a stable regime, right? They're different paths, right? These are 3 different paths that can occur. We see each of them occurring about a third of the time, right? Each of these are very valid paths that have been followed, so I want you to know the 3 different paths. And then when we come back from the break, we'll talk about how those occur, right? About party cohesion and things like that. For now, the biggest thing that we want to cover about why a state is this linkage to the West. Remember that I asked you a question in previous exams about which states would be. Remember, it's proximity and density of ties, right? So Greece is very close to the European Union, right? It's actually in the European Union, but it's very close to these European powerful states. Brazil is close to the United States. They're both close to Western powers. So there is a linkage, right? There could be leverage there. Greece's economy is reliant on trade with the European Union. So there's more leverage, right? Whereas Brazil has its own powerful economy, there's less leverage. So if I was going to ask you, like, which state has the most linkage, which is most likely to be influenced, it's Greece, because it has a smaller economy. It's more reliant on trade with the West. Whereas Brazil trades with Latin America. It trades with China. It's less vulnerable than Greece is. So when I ask you a question like that, look at proximity. How far are they away from Western powers? Look at the size of their economy. Look at how many trade connections they have. Right? Are they part of a union, of a union to our connection organization with Western powers? Right? And that's going to help you determine which state has the most linkage and leverage. Remember that secession is a critical moment, right? Secession is the big moment, right? If you've been in power and you're about to leave power, one of the things that will happen is that you need someone to replace you. And it's very difficult to get someone who's both going to get elected, but also will continue your policies and not have you arrested, right? The fear is you let someone else take over power, and then they have you killed, exiled, they take all your wealth, right? Whatever they do to you, right? Are you protected from that? But if you pick someone who's very trustworthy, they may not be able to get elected, and you still lose power. And then the new party, of course, they're going to try and take your wealth, and they might kill you, right? So the succession moment is very critical. It can be very violent, right? It becomes this very problematic transition. If you're having one person being replaced by another person, and that person is a bunch of networks that are connected to them and not the state, then the transition can be very difficult. And the last part, right, remember that, well, not the last part, but this dual level game, right? You have to deal with domestic factors, right? You have to make sure that you're staying in power domestically, but you also have to make sure that the policies are going to support you even when you're not in power, right? It's different than the dual level game, which we talked about by Putnam. But this dual game is, how do I stay in power and how do I maximize resources? And you're trying to do both. And it's hard to do both, right? If you're just trying to get reelected, that could be easier. You just do what the people want, the most amount of people want. If you're just trying to gain resources, right, you just extract as much resources before you leave power. But if you're trying to do both, stay in power and extract resources, it becomes very difficult in this dual game. And then, I know there's a question about tutelage regimes. I only mentioned two tutelage regimes. The first tutelage regimes are wrong. It is a theocracy. It has religious leaders above elected leaders. The second one that I mentioned is Pakistan. Pakistan has military leaders above elected leaders. Now, this is not a Middle East problem. By no means is it a Middle East problem. I just happen to have more education in Middle East studies than other regions, right? I don't actually know Latin America that well. I know Southeast Asia, but I don't know Western Hemisphere very well, right? My focus happens to be Middle East and sort of Southeast Asia, right? Or Southeast and Southwest Asia is my focus, right? So I use those two cases. Those are the only two cases that I mentioned are tutelage regimes. So if you get a question about tutelage regimes that has Iran or Pakistan in the answer, right, those are going to be the types of states you want to look at. Okay. Oil is a resource. If I have this resource, right, how does this resource first work? This is the last part, and we'll go over, right? I have oil, and so I don't have to, right, tax, right? Instead of taxing, I can do rinsing. I can sell that resource for money to a corporation, right? BP or whatever other oil company. I say, you mine the oil, and then you pay me a certain amount. And then I use that to run the government, to buy off, co-opt my elites, patronage jobs, right, clientelist networks. I pay for all that, and so how it works is I'm not responsive to my public. I don't build roads and bridges because I don't need them to fund the government. I don't respond to their calls for reform because I'm not taxing them. I can say, look, we're not taxing you, we're also not providing these services, right? And people will accept that. They say, yeah, don't tax me and don't provide these services. I'll just keep what I have, right? And so you're not responsive to your population when you have these rents. So that's the part that I want you to know. Yes, it might make your regime more stable. There's this coup-proofing aspect. But the biggest part is when I have those rents, I can just stabilize my elites, right? I can just hold the elites together that I want, and that'll keep me in power, right? And there are different types of transitions, right? But the important part here is that it maintains, right? And rentier state theory is the theory that uses this, that you don't rely on taxpayers. That's the name of the theory. But here, I don't ask you about the data set as much. Some of these things aren't as important, right? We've already talked about selection bias, but I do believe there's one. I don't think I asked you about endogeneity. Endogeneity is a question you'll get into, but I don't think it's that important. The last part is rentier theory does not seem to be the correct answer. What really matters here, according to Wright and Geddes, is that you're coup-proofing. You're not preventing, the population from uprising. What you're preventing is small elite groups who want access to those resources. You're using the rents to build a coercive capacity, a military or a secret police that prevent another group, domestic group, from stealing power from you, taking over the capital, from exiling you, from killing you, right? And so coup-proofing is how oil maintains authoritarian regimes, how it maintains their survival. That's what it does. It doesn't prevent transitions according to Scotchpole's argument. It just prevents small groups of elites from gaining power by taking it from you violently, right? So let's take a break. I'm going to stop the recording and we'll come back at 10 o'clock.